Hello. Welcome to Talk About It, a video series where experts and people with lived experiences will discuss issues and topics around substance use disorder. This series was created by Partnership to End Addiction, a national nonprofit that helps families prevent and treat addiction and support recovery for their children and loved ones. Partnership to End Addiction provides free, confidential support for families looking for answers for themselves and their loved ones. They also activate the voices of families to help other parents reduce the stigma and increase compassion. I am your host, Glozell. Today we will be talking about addiction and substance use. What is normal? Today we have with us Dr. Scott Hadland. Dr. Scott Hadland is a pediatrician and the head of Adolescent Medicine at Mass General Hospital for Children and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Hadland takes care of teens and young adults who struggle with addiction and educates other doctors on how to provide the same care in their own clinical practice. We also have Denise Mariano. Denise Mariano is the Director of Family Support and Advocacy at the Partnership to End Addiction. Denise is also part of a family in recovery from addiction. We have with us today Jessica Lahey. Jessica Lahey is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Gift of Failure, and her new book, The Addiction Inoculation. She is a mom, a veteran teacher, a prevention coach, and has 8.5 years in recovery herself. Thank you for being here. Today's question, let's start off with, you all have different perspectives. Scott, you're a pediatrician and help families. Jessica, you have been open about your own experiences. Denise, you have experienced having traveled this journey with your son. Can you share with us your perspective on how one can stay connected with their child and why does communication play such an important role?
For me, staying connected is about creating a safe environment, welcoming our children, right? And it's not just about that communication, but listening. So often we're not listening, we're thinking of our next thought. What that means is just really asking them open-ended questions, right? Asking what's going on in your life. And then also like being specific when we're wanting to talk to them and taking some responsibility at times as well. I know on the journey with our son, scared to death, right? But I have to label my own feelings too, kind of knock on that door and ask permission for open-ended questions, but also to say, you know what, I'm really worried and I'm not doing well either. And I'm sorry if I come after you, right? Or just laying that groundwork. And we want that invitation for them to come back and speak to us, right?
Denise has so many great points. I mean, I think as someone who has been a middle and high school teacher for a very, very long time, knowing when those learning moments can happen, it's not always on our time schedule, not always on our agenda, when they're ready to listen. So, when I talk about prevention, especially with parents, I say, this starts really early and we have to talk about it often because one of the things I also know as a parent and a teacher is that when you come at a kid with okay, now we're going to have the talk, they just sort of shut down. But if it's a part of having a normal conversation, whether it's about what's happening with their friends, what's happening at their school, something we heard on the news, isn't it scary that, fentanyl's getting mixed with other drugs? And what do you think about that? And, all of these issues that may not be something I can force to happen on my time, I can find ways in if we're talking about it often enough and if it's a part of our everyday conversation. And definitely having dinner together as often as possible has been one of the ways that we've allowed that to happen as well.
Yeah, Denise and Jessica have raised just such great points. What's really key here is the communication that parents have with their kids and the relationships that they build. And these two sort of foundations are really built over time. And as Jessica just said, they start really young, right? You want to start these conversations around substances and mental health more broadly at a really young age and continue them through the teenage years. And the reason for that is, when the teenage years come, you need to be able as a parent to strike this really tricky balance. And that is around counseling, your teen that you really don't want them to use substances, that that's not the healthiest thing for them, that there are numerous risks associated with substance use. But at the same time, you want to create an environment where your teen, if they do use or they're thinking about using, feels comfortable enough to come to you to talk about it.
I can remember creating code words when they were in an uncomfortable situation, right? And what that meant is kind of need to get out of this situation and I need a ride home. And so many might question, like, are we enabling that behavior, right, for offering that ride home? But when they come home and that green light comes on and we can talk about it the next day and again feel really safe, I think that's so critical. And then to just piggyback on what he said, starting this conversation early.
How early is early? You know, you don't want to like, well, we don't need to talk about this if you're not interested, but I want you to be prepared. My daughter is 5 and I'm like, well, when should you start?
Now you start now.
Yeah,
And
okay.
I mean, I talk about this a lot in, these are hard conversations to have. And you're not talking about crystal methamphetamine use with a 5-year-old, but you are talking about general topics of health and welfare. Things like, why do you think we don't swallow the toothpaste after we brush our teeth? Why does this medicine bottle have mommy's name on it and not your name? If you got the same illness that mommy got, do you think that you could just take pills out of this bottle and it would make you better, like it might make mommy better? Well, of course not. Mommy's different. We're different sizes. We have different body chemistry. So that's why it's really, really important that you don't ever take medicines that don't have your name on the bottle.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as somebody who's read all the studies that are out there, I can assure everybody that there is not a single study out there that shows that when parents talk to their kids about substances at a young age, that it somehow makes it so that a kid is going to be more likely to go on and use substances. That's not the case. And so you're not creating a problem where one didn't exist by having these conversations. And I think Jessica really hit the nail on the head. You just want these conversations to be developmentally appropriate.
Do you feel like it's inevitable that teens are going to try drugs or alcohol at some point?
What's really interesting is when I started writing the addiction inoculation, there were certain things like I said, well, I can't have a college chapter in this book because everyone drinks in college. And then I was shocked to find out that that's absolutely not true. And so I think a lot of what we're having to do is beat back the media. The impression we tend to get through movies and through the media that alcohol is an essential part of every part of life and that it's something that quote unquote everyone's doing it. So it's really important. For example, if we have an 8th grade kid, a kid who is right there in the middle of that sort of average age of initiation for alcohol, for example, and a kid comes to them and says, here, try this sip of beer, everybody's doing it, it's no big deal. If your kid knows that that's just not true, that less than 25%, 24.7% of 8th graders admit by the end of 8th grade that they have had any sip of alcohol before the end of 8th grade. That's not everybody. That's less than a quarter. And that's really important information.
Yeah, I think Jessica makes a really important point here. And that is that, if you look at national data, the majority of high school students are actually choosing not to use any substances whatsoever. And I, as a pediatrician, ask every single patient that I see every year for their annual physical exam about whether they're using substances. And my experience on the front line is that most youth choose not to use substances. I often hear from the youth that I take care of in my own clinical practice, things like, well, I hear you telling me that most people choose not to use substances, but that isn't what I feel. I feel like everybody around me is using substances. And I think it's important to, again, acknowledge that sometimes people that use substances are loud about it, and that people who choose not to use substances often sort of don't go around advertising that. And so, again, I think we just have to reinforce this message over and over because it's so key and it's backed up by data.
There's actually a term for that overestimation. It's called pluralistic ignorance. And the scary thing about it is that boys in general, these are big generalizations, boys will tend to raise their level of consumption in order to match what they believe the perception of the norm to be. So the more we we sort of back up this erroneous overestimation of how much people drink and how important it is as a part of life, the more we're actually raising the amount that that some kids will drink. Girls may not raise their level in order to match their perceived norm, but if they don't want to drink, what they'll do is withdraw, which is also dangerous too for girls. So it's really important to understand and to give the message to kids that yes, we overestimate. Here are the real numbers. No, everybody's not doing it. So don't feel like you have to be pressured because you're not part of some imagined majority, because they're not.
I'm probably coming from a different lens, just experiencing, the journey that we've been on. And so if I think about that early touch point, I think about parents just, giving underage drinking a rite of passage, right? And so for me, instead of thinking that way, is let's take these teachable moments that we spoke about, previously, and just really dig in and create that safe environment where they can talk to us. And for those children and loved ones and neighbors that are choosing to use substances, really being mindful that most often it's not because they want to get high or to get drunk. There's something else going on in their life.
We touched on parents, because some parents believe this and some don't. And as a mother of a 5-year-old, I don't know what to do. Some people feel like it's okay to introduce alcohol at home because they're going to try it anyway. So at least they're safe, or some other substance, because at least, I'm there. Is it safe for me to introduce a teen, to alcohol, or, at home?
What the data says is really interesting is that parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until it is legal for you, have kids with much lower rates of substance use disorder during their lifetime. Parents who have a message of permissiveness when it comes to alcohol under the age of 21 have kids with much higher rates of substance use disorder during their lifetime. Giving kids alcohol, number one, it's a felony. Number two, I guess three, it's against the law. Number two, it's a permissive stance on alcohol. So you're raising your own child, and P.S. you're putting other children in danger. And number three, the myth of European moderate European alcohol intake is in general a myth, just that, a myth.
All of the data suggests that when we have clear messaging as parents, as pediatricians, as teachers around alcohol and the risks that it has for young people, and don't take a permissive stance, that actually we have better outcomes.
We can no longer sit there and talk about stats again and again and bore our families and our children with the stats. We need to talk about reality and what's happening, and really educate these parents, like, here's the legalities of what might happen.
I'd love to add that I'm raising two kids with two very different sets of rules because of what I've learned. So I have a 22-year-old who was raised in a home where he was allowed to have sips. I even admit in the addiction inoculation that my oldest kid's very first taste of wine came off of my finger when he was an infant, because it was a really nice bottle of wine. And I just didn't know any better. But I also wrote a book called The Gift of Failure that's completely about learning from your mistakes, moving forward with new information, and learning from, what you've read and the information, the best information you have at hand. So I now have an 18-year-old who is not allowed sips, who has a very clear, we give him a very clear message of, no, it's just not cool until you're of legal age.
I know we touched on this, but can you share more about setting limits and boundaries and monitoring behaviors?
So often the limit setting or the punishment should be based on the particular behavior. And so what that looks like, and I won't get into the rock bottom now, you might have someone, that's vaping or coming in late, and that family is saying, we're done, we're kicking you out. We can't drop that big, hammer. We have to look at what that behavior is and really try to understand, let's try to work with them. I was not good with limit setting and what we call, setting boundaries, right? And I was judged for that as a family member, as my son was involved in substance use. There was a time when our son was living on the streets of Los Angeles and connected with us every day. And he would tell me and my husband that he was hungry. Could you please send me money? So our limit or our boundary was, we won't send you money, but we will send you a pizza. And that's the best I could do that day.
Denise, were you and your husband on the same page with these limitations? Was he going like, okay, yes, we're not going to send the money, we're just going to send the pizza, I mean, or whatever the situation was? You were on the same page?
We did come together and represent a united front, but it took some time, and all families experience this.
Dr. Scott, I would like to hear from you because you're a pediatrician and you're dealing with parents also. Do you find it that they have different approaches, or what's your advice in that aspect? Like, get together before y'all, united front, as Denise said.
Yeah, consistent parenting, through all of childhood into adolescence is so key, so that, teens don't end up splitting their parents and getting sort of one answer from one and then turning to the other to get a different answer. Earlier on in the trajectory of substance use, when you've got a teen who might be starting to bend some rules, they may not yet have a serious problem or have a problem that's just starting to develop. We'll talk about the C's. And the C's are remembering that parents often control the cash that their kids carry and pay for the credit cards that their kids may have, and that these are sort of levers that parents can pull back on if their teen is using cash to buy alcohol or other substances. That parents need to institute curfews and have expectations around what times teens need to be home. We'll talk about the car. The car is often something that the kid borrows from the parent, and there should be expectations around what the teen is allowed to do with the car and when they need to be home. And so there's all these different sort of opportunities for parents to sort of institute boundaries within which they think their teen should operate. The last C, by the way, that's very important in the year 2021 is cell phone. That many parents are paying for a cell phone for teens that can be used to text people, to make plans to use substances or buy substances. And this is something that parents often need to work to crack down on as well.
Thank you. Jessica, would you like to chime in here?
What I try to do with my own kids is remember that my relationship with them really depends on trust, and that trust goes both ways. I don't tend to be a big monitor of their electronics and that kind of thing. I don't use like the Find My iPhone to track them, and I talk to lots and lots of kids whose parents do. But on the other hand, that is always subject to change. And that change is going to be based on what I see in my kids, whether that's a mood change, whether that's a change in sleeping habits or eating, all of that sort of thing. So in the end, yes, I do hold the keys to the car and the cell phone and all of those things, and that is open to change. I would also love to point out that going in the other direction of just lockdown and total control over your kid may backfire too. We do know, for example, that kids who are more controlled by their parents lie to their parents a lot more, actually. So finding a balance is going to be really important, and having a relationship that's built on some mutual trust and understanding of the why and not just the because I said so, I think is going to be really important.
So important. I just wanted to add one thing, because my hope is that so many will be listening to this powerful Talk About It series. And again, coming from my own personal journey, when we think about setting limits, we also have to understand punitive damages, right? And so what does that look like? It looks like maybe taking that phone away, or saying you can't go to your baseball practice, or you can't use the car. What does that look like? So for me, individual, taking the phone away, now I have no communication with my son. So thinking of alternatives, right? And maybe taking that data away, but I need to communicate with him. And then thinking about, what does it look like if I don't give him the card to go to his practice for baseball or football? What does it look like when I take that away from him, when that is the positive reinforcers in his life? And so again, there is no one size fits all. It's really subjective and unique to each family. And we have to think of, when we set limits, how is my health as a parent, and what positive reinforcers am I taking away from my child?
Is it true that someone who is struggling with addiction must hit rock bottom? Denise, I know your answer. I know it.
So I talk about this extensively, and I really would so love to hear Jessica and Scott's viewpoint. But here's where I'm at. Being on this journey for 10 years, advocating in this space for 10 years, seeing the CDC news that came out the other day of 100,000 overdose since April. Rock bottom's not working. Rock bottom, what is the definition of rock bottom? What we're seeing, it's death. Through the skills and tools that we offer families at the partnership, we don't believe in rock bottom. We lift our loved ones up, right? We know the shame and stigma they're already carrying. Why kick them down any further? So just, I could take up this whole conversation and I won't do that, but we need to eradicate it. It doesn't need to happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with Denise. Rock bottom has not worked. In fact, I think rock bottom is a reflection of the fact that we haven't done enough for youth and for families for so long, that so many youth end up at rock bottom that we've come to think that that's the only path.
This actually goes back to an earlier conversation we had about how to talk about it with your kids so that your kid can come to you and say, Mom, I screwed up, or Dad, I screwed up. We tend to have this really black and white vision in our society of, okay, well, if you've messed up, if you had sex, you're no longer a virgin. If you had a drink, you're no longer sober. All of those sorts of all or nothing language does not help anyone. So we want our kid, when they come to us and say, you know what, I screwed up, we say, okay, what did we learn from this? How are we going to go forward and do better next time? This is not like you're ruined now that you've made this mistake. This is an experience you had. How are we going to make the best of it? How are we going to learn from it? And how are we going to do better next time? Rather than viewing it as some terminal, well, it's over now, there's no moving forward from here. I think that's important in recovery, and it's important in prevention and in parenting.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Dr. Hadland, Jessica, and Denise for joining us. For more information and resources, please visit drugfree.org. I'm your host, Glozell, for Talk About It, a series by Partnership to End Addiction.